Hi, this is Jay from paulpolito.com, and welcome to the next installment in our screencast series about Linux installation and package management. 102.2 Install a Boot Manager, Part 1. In this screencast, we will talk in general about boot managers and about the boot manager grub in more detail. You will get to know how to install, configure, and interact with grub. The boot manager. There are two boot managers commonly associated with current releases of Linux operating systems. Their names are Grub, which stands for Grand Unified Bootloader, and Lilo, which is an acronym for Linux Loader. On most Linux distributions, Grub is now the default boot manager, but Lilo is still used in a few areas and is also still part of the LPI exam. The LPI-C1 objectives specifically state that you need to know how to install and configure a bootloader such as Grub. For that reason, you can expect more exam questions on Grub than on Lilo. But anyway, you have to know about both, so let's start. Both boot managers, Lilo and Grub, reside in the first 512 bytes of a hard disk. This is the area where BIOS is looking for information about how to boot the system. This 512 byte sector is called the Master Boot Record, or MBR. At this point, we encounter the first difference between Grub and Lilo. While Lilo's configuration resides entirely in those 512 bytes, Grub configures a pointer from that 512 byte sector to its configuration file, which is located in the /boot directory. Install Grub. If not already installed on your system, you can install Grub by using the grub install command. This will implement Grub by adding a pointer from the master boot record of the specified hard disk. The grub install command needs the appropriate device file of the hard disk with the /boot directory. Device files can either be identified using the mount or the fdisk-l command, as you see in this example. /dev HDA1 is configured as the device from where our system will boot. Because our target is to modify the MBR of the entire hard disk, we have to give the command grub install /dev HDA to write the appropriate link from the MBR to the grub configuration file. And that is all it takes to install Grub on your system. Configure Grub. To configure Grub, we have to open its configuration file, which is /boot grub menu lst. Often you will find this file configured as a soft link to the /boot grub grub.conf configuration file. The menu lst file is divided into several stanzas which can be configured for different kernels or even for different operating systems. In general, one can say that every time you see the word title appear in the menu lst file, a new stanza begins. One of the first and most important entries in the /boot grub menu lst file is therefore default equals 0. The default directive specifies the default stanza booted from the grub menu, which in this case is the first stanza. Yes, that's right, default equals 0 means the first stanza, and default equals 1 would mean to boot by default from the second stanza. Now let's have a look at the first grub stanza. As you recognize in this stanza, the word root is mentioned twice. The confusing part about this is actually that the second root has a different meaning. I'll explain this now. Root HD00 specifies the location of the /boot directory, which contains important boot files such as the Linux kernel and the initial RAM disk. HD00 means that the /boot directory is located on the first partition of the first hard drive, where the first 0 means first hard drive and the second 0 means first partition. If the /boot directory were located on the first partition of the second hard drive, then the entry would be HD10, and so forth. The kernel directive looks for the Linux kernel. The / means that it does so in the top-level directory as defined by the entry root HD00. What follows after the / is the file name of the actual Linux kernel. The row in this line mounts the top-level root directory that follows. In this case, this is a logical volume, but in many other cases, you will find something here like /dev HDA2, which would mean that the top-level root directory is located on the second partition of the first hard drive. The next parts of this line, RHGB and quiet, specify a Red Hat graphical boot with many boot messages hidden. Finally, the init.rd line specifies the location of the initial RAM disk, which we covered already in another screencast. Interact with grub. Although we have already discussed this in another Paul Polito screencast, we will repeat some points and add some new points regarding interaction with grub now. Sometimes it can be very helpful to enter during startup directly into the single user mode. Here is how to do that. After powering on the system, you'll often see a short grub message like, press any key to enter the menu. Doing that will bring you to the grub menu. Now press E to enter the edit mode. Navigate with the arrow key to the line which starts with kernel, and then press E again. At the end of the line, add the number 1, which stands for the run level 1, and then press enter. To finally boot the system, press the B key. The system will now start up in run level 1, which is the repair and single user mode. With this method, you can give any additional kernel command options like no ACPI, no APM, no DMA, and so forth to the kernel. The system will then boot with these parameters. Summary. There are two boot managers commonly associated with current releases of Linux operating systems. Their names are Grub and Lilo. Both boot managers reside in the first 512 bytes of a hard disk. This is the area where BIOS is looking for information about how to boot the system. This 512-byte sector is called the Master Boot Record, or MBR. You can install Grub by using the grub install command. The standard configuration file of Grub is /boot grub menu lst. Often, you will find this file configured as a soft link to the /boot grub grub.conf configuration file. The /boot grub menu lst file is divided into several stanzas, which can be configured for different kernels or even different operating systems. You can add additional kernel command options directly in the grub menu during system startup. Study points. Examine the file /boot grub menu lst and understand the syntax of this file. Although there is no direct man page for menu lst, you should have a look at this file, /user share doc grub-0.97 menu lst. Of course, on your system, this file could be located in a different place. Boot your Linux system from the grub menu into run level 1. Search for the file kernel-parameters.txt and try out a few kernel parameters mentioned in that file. This is Jay from paulpolito.com, and thanks for watching this screencast about Linux installation and package management. Until next time,